Hello, everyone. Welcome again to our webinar. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're coming from. It's always great to see where everyone is watching the webinar from. Um, we are, this is the last of our webinar series. This is our Farming with Conservation in Mind webinar. We're so happy to have you all here with us today to explore practical ways farms can integrate conservation and biodiversity into their land stewardship and management. My name is Teresa. I'm the Communications and Community Engagement Coordinator at OFT. And before we begin our session, I would love to start with a land acknowledgement. OFT works across all of Ontario, but we are centered in Guelph on treaty lands and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit of the Anishinaabe peoples, the original and ongoing protectors of these lands. Guelph resides on Treaty 3 between the Lakes Purchase Territory, representing an agreement and respectful partnership between peoples of different nations. As settler nations work to reconcile our relationships with Indigenous nations, we want our work at the Farmland Trust to reflect the respect deserved to the legacy of the original caretakers, whose stewardship of the land has allowed us to enjoy the land's beauty and bounty today. Especially given that the role of land as possession has been used as a tool of colonization, this context is really important to acknowledge. So I will now move on to some webinar housekeeping. So throughout the webinar, we encourage our participants to share comments in the chat. However, if you have questions for our speakers, Brenda or Sam, please submit those using the Q&A feature. If you have a similar question to any that have already been submitted, you can upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up icon, and this moves the question up in the queue and it allows us to answer the most popular questions first. I'll be on hand to provide support during the webinar, so if you have any technical issues, you can message me directly using the chat feature. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with OFT and what we do, allow me to introduce us. We are a not-for-profit, and we are the only provincial-wide conservation organization with a mission dedicated to the protection and preservation of Ontario's agricultural landscapes. It's so critical that we protect these lands because Ontario's prime agricultural land is a finite, non-renewable resource that comprises less than 5% of Ontario's land base. Farmland is the foundation of our agri-food sector and provides us with locally produced foods, employs more than 800,000 Ontarians, and contributes over $49 billion annually to the province's GDP. And yet, Ontario has lost 20% of our farmland in the last 40 years. The rate of farmland loss nearly doubled between 2016 and 2021 to a rate of 319 acres per day. And once farmland is developed, it's gone forever. So it's more important now than ever before that we protect our agricultural landscapes. And what do we do at the Ontario Farmland Trust to achieve this mission? Well, we have a few main program areas. The first of them and our main activity is permanently protecting farmland. We do that by working with farmland owners who want to protect their lands from future development. And we help them do this by placing a farmland easement agreement on the title of their property, or if they wish, they can donate their farm property to OFT. We also engage in provincial policy discussions on changing land use policy that impacts farmland, as well as our education and community engagement programming includes several outreach initiatives that aim to educate the public on what threatens these lands and how we can collectively work to protect them, including webinars like this one. So to date, we have permanently protected 26 properties amounting to over 2,700 acres of farmland, forests, and wetlands across the province. On this map, you'll see the areas in which we have permanently protected farmlands, as well as where our current projects are taking place. And I'd also like to mention that it is not without the support of our dedicated supporters and donors that we're able to make such a huge impact on farmland preservation. And with that, I will begin the webinar today. For this webinar, we are so happy to have both Brenda from Farmers for Climate Solutions and Sam from the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association join us here today to share their expertise on best farm management practices for supporting conservation and biodiversity. I'll start by introducing Brenda. Brenda is a Canadian-born Chinese agro-ecological sheep farmer who left a financial career to start her own farm in in 2009. For 14 seasons, she ran a 1-acre market garden, supplying vegetables to GTA, CSA members while growing her sheep flock. And now she works with Farmers for Climate Solutions, helping farmers adopt climate beneficial practices. Brenda, thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm going to share my screen. Will it just overlay yours, Teresa, or will it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Let me introduce Sam, and then
Okay,
I'll give it over to you.
all right, perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so Sam helps deliver cost-share programs for farmers and rural landowners. Many of these programs focus on environmental stewardship-related practices, including wetland and grassland restoration, tree planting, rotational grazing, and much more. Sam has learned and continues to learn about Ontario agriculture through this role and is fortunate to work with many talented and experienced individuals within and outside of OSCIA. Sam, thank you for joining us here today as well. And now I will stop sharing my screen, and Brenda, you can go ahead and share yours.
Thank you, Teresa.
Find my cursor. All right.
Okay. Teresa, could you maybe thumbs up or something? Okay, perfect. Oh, and of course it says my internet connection is unstable right when I start my presentation. Hopefully it'll be good for the next 15 odd minutes. Okay, so again, I work with Farmers for Climate Solutions, but I'm also a farmer in southwestern Ontario in Grey County, which is just about 2 hours, 1.5 hours north of Guelph. I've been farming for over or about 15 years, and we also do a lot of conservation biodiversity support on the farm as I do a lot of intensive managed grazing. So what I'll be talking about today is a combination of our work at Farmers for Climate Solutions, also my experience on the ground as a farmer. I'm also a member of the Alice Pack for Grey Bruce area. So, I think for about 11 or so years. So a lot of experience with talking with farmers about all the little tweaks you can do on your farms. So first, I just wanted to do a quick introduction of who we are as Farmers for Climate Solutions. So we are a national organization, nonpartisan, and we are farmer and rancher led, hence why I work for them. And we do policy advancement and field programming to support farmers in the face of climate change. So I work mostly on the field programming side to do with what we call FARM, F-A-R-M, the Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. So in this specifically, at this point in time, we have 3 beneficial management practices that we focus on. It's not that there are not many more, and there's definitely a lot of nuance within all of these, but these are our 3 main buckets that we work on right now. So that includes advanced nitrogen management, advanced grazing systems, or intensive managed grazing, rotational grazing, there's a lot of different names for it, and cover cropping. And I won't go into like the details of how to do each of these things today because there's not enough time for that. But I guess I will talk about some of the knock-on effects from these things being used on farm. So one of the first questions, that farmers would ask, maybe they don't need to ask this question, but maybe in general society will ask this as well. Why is it important on farms? And, first of all, we are like the land base, right? Where we farm is where nature also lives. It's where human lives. It's where nature lives. It's where habitat is for much of the the biodiversity that's out there. And so, for farmers, we kind of have to think of this because we are land-based, and conservation of biodiversity is a very land-specific sort of thing. And one of the things that I want to bring up specifically today is that there's this thing called messy fields and the halo effect. Now, if you look this up online, you're going to find all sorts of things, but you'll also find the ABC lab at the University of Calgary, where they're doing all sorts of research on this. So just really, this is like a very small explanation of this, but the idea is that if you have little pieces of habitat all around your farm that are in perennial species, hopefully native perennial species to your area, they end up hosting a lot of beneficial insects and creatures, which end up providing ecosystem services for your farm. So right now, the sort of norm that we have in conventional agriculture is to have, a very trimmed and maintained, mowed, clean looking fields, rectangles, everything around your field is mowed, so it's nice and short. There are sometimes good reasons for doing that, but there are also ways of looking at things where having a messier field edge or keeping certain areas of your field not cropped or mowed, but rather in perennial uh, um, plants, where this can actually be of benefit to both biodiversity on farm as well as actually crop yields. So the halo effect itself, if you'll see this little piece on the side here, you'll see that the brighter yellow areas sort of around all these messy places are where you actually get a yield bump. And so there does need to be more research on this. It is not well understood exactly why this happens, but a lot of speculation has to do with things like having better pollination there, better predatory insects to get rid of pests, more beetles, for example, to eat your weed seeds. And overall, in those perennial areas, you end up having deeper rooted systems that can help with soil organic matter and just soil life in general, which actually makes you a bit more resilient to things like flood or drought because you are actually having the soil be more of a moisture sponge. So I could go on about this. At the very end, I will make a note of where you can go to our Farm Learning Hub, which has tons of information on our beneficial management practices for free. Anybody can enroll in any of those courses to read about how all of the different BMPs can actually benefit your farms, both for productivity and for soil health and for the environment. But I want to talk specifically about a few conservation and biodiversity issues today. First off is avoided conversion to cropland. I think this is very much at the heart of what OFT also cares about. Not just completely going from, a farm to being like a subdevelopment, but also if a farm is a combination of pastures or hayfields and, trees and wetlands and all that sort of thing, there is a benefit to preserving some of those, not to like stop agriculture from happening, but there are ways to do things where you can also maintain agriculture. One of the great things for that is actually grazing. That's partly why I'm a sheep farmer. And managed intensive grazing can maintain grassland species of birds and plants while also raising animals. Now, to be able to do that profitably, of course, does take a lot of tweaking and time and a lot of management. So I'm not saying that this is, the that you can do this and all of a sudden you will, make as much money as you would being a cropper. But there's a larger conversation to be had about sort of the ecosystem services that are maintained in one agricultural system versus another. So right there, when I talk about maintaining hayfields and pastures, you could even take it further and even do things like delayed haying or grazing so that you can ensure the fledging of grassland birds after you've done some sort of an audit to make sure that they're there, because they're not everywhere, right? They do have their preferred areas. Um, and also, we talk about preserving hedgerows and tree lines because they act as habitat and as well as corridors for animals to travel in, and the preservation of wetland areas. Now, you probably think in Ontario, oh, we have so much water, but we do a lot of drainage in Ontario, and we still do have a lot of water, and hopefully we have a lot of water for the long term. But we don't want to become like California, which had more water than it has now. So, sometimes we think that, oh, we have such an abundance of these things, we can't lose it. But actually, we can if we don't think about long term how we practice the agriculture to feed. See biodiversity and soil health increase with managed grazing on the landscape is actually a wonderful thing.
Sorry to let you know, Brenda, you did pause there for a few minutes. We or moments. We
Okay.
kind of just missed the last few sentences, but you're back and good now.
Okay, so I was just saying that I am biased as a sheep farmer. towards grazing management. So I do have to put that out there. But I do, as a farmer, I have noticed a lot of increase in biodiversity, in moisture retention, and resilience to both flooding, because your soils can absorb more. There's a whole lot less ponding and runoff off the top, and also in absorbing rain when it does come, so that your forages stay lush longer than before grazing happened on my farm. So the other thing I want to bring up is this idea of profitability mapping. And this is mostly something that happens in cropping situations. And this is where you take a bunch of yield data from your tractors, your combine. There's a lot of technology out there to do this. You can also do this slightly from satellites and soil sampling across your fields. There's like a lot of different ways to do this. So again, this is not something I'm going to explain how to do right now. But this precision ag data can really identify areas of low productivity, which you might be better off keeping in perennial vegetation. And you might also think to yourself, oh, this messy field, I've got this little patch here that I don't plant or mow, and this other patch there. How is that really useful? They're too small to do anything. There is a Dr. Lenore Farig from actually Carleton University in Ottawa, who has done a lot of like mathematical modeling and studies to show that conserving a whole bunch of small patches is just as valuable or even more valuable than having any one large area the same size. So, there isn't any space that's too small. Like, we don't have to think of like all or nothing. We don't have to have just like giant forest area over there and giant farm here. We can actually mix this together and conserve more habitat and more biodiversity overall. The other sort of concept I want to think about when we're talking about agriculture and farming, or farming and conservation, is that there's also this idea of trade-offs to have no net loss of some sort of habitat. So, for example, in Ontario, for cropland, we do a lot of drainage because otherwise we can't get into the fields early enough in spring, or we don't have uh, like the best situation for having a good crop grow. And sometimes, you do want to straighten out a field or make it easier for your equipment to get it in and out. So these are very practical reasons why croppers do need to do drainage or like square out a field or whatnot. But you can also plan to have trade-offs. You could plan to have the drainage from that cropland go into managed wetland areas. And this picture down here is actually from Ducks Unlimited. You can set it up so that you can actually have a sediment capture area, which is made so that you can actually go in there and clean it out occasionally so that you don't just lose it, because of course it fills up eventually. So you do have to plan for being able to clean it out. And then, you have the rest of your wetland continue on, and when it leaves at the outlet, you could have permanently grassed waterways, for example, to just slow down that water across the surface of your land, and essentially to take a lot of the nutrient runoff that comes from your farms and contain it a little bit instead of having it go straight into waterways. So, you can definitely do drainage in ways that are better than just ending up having it surface runoff straight into waterways. If you did have to straighten out the edges of your field, we've seen examples in Quebec where you have like maybe a few smaller fields, and for your equipment purposes, you want to make it a bit bigger. So you take out some of the tree lines in between. Maybe in doing so, you will look at somewhere else on your farm where it's maybe not as profitable to crop. And maybe you will beef up that tree line. You will add in some more shrubs. You will add in some more perennial or native plantings, and so on and so forth. So it's really this idea of trying to make up for what you take out with another area. So this doesn't work everywhere, but it's certainly an idea that can be thought of at the beginning. If it's planned for, it can actually help your farm overall. If it's either forced on you by potential legislation, in the decades to come, you don't get as much choice over that. But right now, you as your farmer, knowing what your land is like, you probably have areas already where you're kind of like, this area here, I definitely see a lot of, wildlife there, or certain birds that you like or whatnot, or even just plants. And you think to yourself, well, maybe I can, clear this one area here and then beef up this area there. Like, that is better, I think, overall for on-farm conservation than just taking everything out. So that's something to consider. The other thing we talk about a lot is biodiversity. So when we do our like cover crop, on farms or whatnot, we do talk a lot about having more multi-species cover crops once you're sort of used to it. I mean, I wouldn't get too crazy. Don't do like a 12 species, multi-species cover crop your very first time trying to do a cover crop. Start simple. That way you can succeed better. But what we find is that when you have more species in your cover crops, you actually feed more below ground microbial life because every plant exudes slightly different things, whether they're types of carbohydrates or the way that they react with mycorrhizal fungi or whatnot. And we don't actually know tons about those interactions, but we know that when there's more different kinds, we get more different kinds below. And at the simplest thing that can happen to incorporating more biodiversity is to actually just have more diversified crop rotations. So if you're more of like a corn, soy, if you add a small grain in as like a corn, soy, wheat, corn, soy, oat, corn, soy, flax, even perhaps flax still grows in Ontario. The soil benefits from having one more type of crop in that rotation are immense. Also, if you do have areas around your field that you want to be able to like drive around your fields or whatnot, you can plant them into pollinator strips and other different things to just, again, bring more biodiversity on farm. In terms of like if you are a grazier, you can also increase the biodiversity in your permanent pastures by doing a lot of things like overseeding, whether it's frost drilling, no-till drilling, feeding legume seeds to your animals with their mineral, or there are some crazy drone seeders out there right now that can carry like 50 pounds of like, for example, a mixed clover type seed and just throw that out there. And it's actually fairly economical. You can also go the route of silvopasture and agroforestry, where you start intentionally planting trees back into more pastured areas or even cropped areas. So the list is very long. I'll just show a couple examples here of groups. The New Farm, they are a vegetable, mostly salad green operation in Creemore, so it's not far from where a lot of us are here today. And of course, they cover crop a lot, as you can see, for biodiversity, soil health, and for profitability. This pair is from Quebec, and you could see how, look at all those flowers in their pasture and their cattle are grazing in there. So there's a lot of opportunity for agriculture to go hand in hand with a lot of increased biodiversity. And I had mentioned before that we do have our Farm Learning Hub. So it's right there, www.farmlearninghub.ca. Everything on there is free. Make yourself a free account and you can go through all sorts of curriculums to do with cover cropping, advanced nitrogen management, and advanced grazing systems. Advanced nitrogen management might seem like a strange thing to include here when we're talking about biodiversity or and conservation, but the whole idea of profitability mapping actually is to partially reduce your inputs in those areas. So actually it is part of an advanced nitrogen management as well. So just a small handful of funding programs that are available out there. Sam is going to talk a lot about all the ones that are run through OSCIA, which are the top three there. But there are also some other groups across Ontario, like ALICE, which I mentioned, Alternative Land Use Services. Ducks Unlimited is still out there and doing things. Conservation authorities across the province are doing a lot of things to do with water quality. And there's still a Forests Canada / Forests Ontario program out there. And I'm sure there are a few more. So I will leave it there so that I think actually we're going to ask questions at the end. Is that right, Teresa?
Yes, exactly.
All
Thank
right.
you so much, Brenda. That was awesome. Sam, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you. Yeah, just give me a second here, make sure I've got everything set up. And from the beginning. Okay. Yeah, so thanks again, everyone, for your time today and for the introduction, Teresa. Brenda and I are covering certainly similar topics today, but I'll be coming from sort of the background of working with Ontario Soil and Crop. So like Teresa mentioned, I'm a programs coordinator with the organization. We are a nonprofit in Ontario. And just to give you a little bit of background in case you're not familiar with Soil and Crop, I know There are some folks on the line today who I imagine are familiar and maybe even are members. And if not, I wanted to give you some context here. So we are a nonprofit grassroots organization. We are based in Guelph with our provincial office. So I work with a team there on cost share delivery. So we deliver federal and provincial cost share programming. We also have a research and knowledge transfer department. And we do have field representatives stationed across the province of Ontario as well to facilitate cost share program delivery to farmers and also workshop delivery as well. And Soil and Crop has local and regional associations throughout the province. You can become a member of your local association, and there are some events and sort of other benefits and lots of things that happen with those local associations. But today I wanted to focus on covering some best management practices for supporting, of course, conservation and biodiversity on farms, and a bit of an OSCA programs perspective there as well. So I wanted to start briefly here, and I know that Brenda, you gave a fantastic sort of similar themed conversation here too about sort of the interconnectedness. So when we're talking about conservation, ecosystem health, biodiversity, environmental stewardship on the farm, interconnectedness is a theme. You're going to find different definitions from different people, but what we do know is that biodiversity and conservation is about interactions at different scales. And we also know that farming is about interactions also at different scales. So on the farm, we want an ecosystem on the farm to generally be able to support the native species that exist on the landscape and to support and not hinder farm productivity. So just as you can alter your production methods on the farm, of course, depending on the type of operation that you have, you can alter how you conserve on the landscape. And the two often interact with one another, which Brenda had demonstrated too, mentioning that halo effect. So there are a few principles to keep in mind here, and this is certainly not exhaustive. This is just me trying to put things into sort of digestible principles to keep in mind. So one of them is that soil is a foundation of healthy ecosystems. When we're thinking about the landscape on the farm and conservation, I think we're often thinking about those obvious wooded areas, natural areas. We do have to keep in mind too that soil itself and the sort of underground landscape is an ecosystem in its own right. And so that comes into play very much so on all sorts of types of farm operations. The second principle to keep in mind is that native areas with variety serve as the most valuable biodiversity refuge on the farm. But that is not to say that there can't be benefits in semi-natural and other areas too. So native certainly is going to have be the most able to be utilized on the landscape by the species there, but non-native habitat can provide things like cover and so on as well. So we don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good. The third one here, maximizing rest periods for your productive land will allow for greater biodiversity. Things that we'll touch on a bit in this presentation, and of course that Brenda had touched on too, things like that rotational grazing allows for rest periods. And lastly here, something to keep in mind with any sort of change you're making on the landscape is that connections between areas on your farm landscape will help biodiversity. So allowing fauna and even flora to be able to move and sort of interact with different parts on the landscape is going to be more helpful than sort of isolated pockets in most cases. So we do want to generally maximize our living roots and plant diversity, maximize our cover, and minimize our disturbance when we're keeping in mind conservation. So with these principles, there are sort of best management practices that we can keep in mind for each of these. Again, absolutely not exhaustive, but some that can have many benefits in different ways. So just for instance here, when we're talking about cover crops, That could be anything, like Brenda said, you could go all the way up to that multiple species cover crop, but you do not have to. Even a single species can have benefits for the soil in terms of creating areas of pores in the aggregate structure of that soil. So allowing nutrients and water to move creates a better habitat for that ecosystem under the ground. And if your cover crop is flowering, that's a great additional benefit that could provide benefits for pollinators. As well too, so some of these, of course, are going to be potentially bigger projects. So some of those concepts around erosion control structures, that's going to depend on your landscape and, potentially very unique depending on the situation. But some of these are also very approachable to consider. So things like that last one listed there, trying not to use your heavy equipment when it is too wet and causing compaction on the landscape. Now, is that conservation overall in the farm landscape? Not necessarily, but it is still impacting that ecosystem under the ground, and it's going to have benefits for your yield and your crop productivity as well. So those are just a few to keep in mind. Second principle here about native refuges and potentially non-native too. So these are going to fall into essentially a couple of categories. So you might be creating these from scratch. So things like planting native trees and grasslands is creating brand new habitat. But things like excluding your livestock from existing areas is very important too to consider. So if you have a water feature or a stream on your farm landscape, that is absolutely an ecosystem to consider as well, and preventing erosion and manure from getting into that aquatic habitat can be very important. Livestock can also certainly, do certain types of damage and disturbance to woodlands too. So sometimes it is just a matter of sort of preventing that disturbance from happening. And of course, as I'm sure many folks who are landowners and farmers themselves know, invasive plant species can be a huge challenge, and they generally are detrimental to biodiversity on the landscape, as well as potentially to, your productive fields as well. So just to keep in mind too that this is not exhaustive, and I want to say too that plantings do not have to be entire fields. You can start small, you can start with corridors. If we're talking about installing new habitat structures, that can look like lots of things. It could be bat roosts, it could be barn swallow structures. And I will share a resource later in this presentation if you'd like to read a little bit more about that. Maximizing rest periods. So this is a big one that I think Brenda did a great job explaining too in the context of sort of the rotational grazing there. So allowing your pasture to have some time to rejuvenate between the livestock being there, very beneficial for species on the farm. And grassland birds in particular. The photo here is of the bobolink. They benefit immensely from delaying your haying until after July 15th to allow fledglings to have a much greater chance of survival after that field is harvested. And it could, again, be relatively small changes. So if it's just looking at what you have already, like your roadsides and marginal lands, and yeah, maybe letting them, become messy, like Brenda said, that can have immense benefits on the landscape too. And lastly, this fourth principle, which I think really is one to keep in mind when we're talking about those previous best management practices, creating connections and seeing what you have already to allow species to move in between is a great place to start. So check out what you already have on the farm is a great first step. You may already have things like field margins, shrubs, deadwood, drainage ditches, riparian areas, even fieldstone piles. They might already be providing some valuable habitat, for instance, to pollinators. So this interconnectedness and this, letting those messy places be and maybe creating connections between them is something to keep in mind. So this is great that we've been talking about, lots of different potential things to get started on your farm in terms of conservation. But for a BMP to be effective, of course, it has to be sustainable. So this is a sustainability triangle. I've spoken about the sort of the top part of the triangle here, so those actual best management practices. But for things to actually be sustainable on farm, you have to have the knowledge and the resources. So how do I execute this? Where do I start? Who can I go to for help? And of course, this right triangle is always a consideration on the farm. On different scales, it's going to be more or less of a consideration depending on how intensive this BMP is or how big of a change it might be. But of course, these can be big cost investments for farmers and can create challenges to cash flow depending on, if you're doing something more intensive like erosion control. So this is something where I think starting small, exactly like Brenda mentioned, we're going to have some of the same themes here, but keeping in mind that, one action at the beginning is fine, and seeing how that one change can impact is great. You don't have to throw the kitchen sink at things and do a bunch of things at once, because then you might not know what worked well or what changed. So you can think about what's feasible. And when it comes to sort of the bottom two triangles, and especially Ontario Soil and Crop focuses on that bottom right triangle, so that financial or economic cost. This organization, we do deliver cost share programs in Ontario to help farmers take on that financial burden. So this is not an exhaustive list. I just drew a few of our supported project categories here that relate to conservation on the farm. And there are logos here of just a few of our funding partners as well. So I will give a bit of a brief overview here. I don't have time to give an overview of each program, but I will include contact information in this presentation too. And of course, you're welcome to reach out with questions. And after this as well, you can ask questions too. So I would be remiss to talk about cost share programs at Soil and Crop without talking about the environmental farm plan. The EFP is what we deliver in Ontario. It is a free workshop, generally 2 days in person if it's your first time doing one or if you haven't done it before. And it does allow for you to take an inventory of your farm operation. This does not just relate to conservation. There are lots of topics that are covered in the EFP, and I've listed just a few of them here. But the EFP does have worksheets on wetlands and wildlife ponds, as well as woodlands. So it helps you take stock of what you have and helps give you a different perspective on your farm. So the EFP it was begun in 1993 as a pilot project, and well over 35,000 participants have done the EFP since 1993. And if you have an EFP and you haven't done one in a period of time, you do have options to renew as well, such as a 1-day renewal. So a really great resource in its own right to give you sort of an action plan going forward for your farm operation. So these are just two of our cost share programs that I wanted to draw attention to because they're a little bit different than the topics that Brenda had covered. But we deliver cost share for our species at risk programs. One is the Species at Risk Partnerships on Agricultural Lands. It's a mouthful, SARPAL. So that is funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and we've delivered it since 2016. It supports several BMPs. I did not have room to list them all on the slide, but things like tree and shrub planting, perennial grass strips, wetland and grassland restoration, cross fencing for rotational grazing, exclusion fencing, and delayed haying. So you have in that program the opportunity to fund project costs at 50% of the cost that you incur. If you are eligible and you apply and meet the criteria, OSCA can reimburse you for 50% of those costs up to a project cap. And then for the SARFIT program, It is a similar set of BMPs with a few additional ones like invasive plant species control, as well as habitat structures. And that can be funded up to 75% cost share for the eligible farmer or landowner who applies. And if you do get up to 75% cost share, you've opted into sort of a voluntary monitoring that can happen on your farm too. So I know that's a lot of information. There are two programs that I can't possibly cover in detail at the moment, but I will show you later in this presentation where to sign up for more information. And I should mention too that SARPAL actually has an intake open right now, specific to tree and shrub planting. So if you're in Ontario and you did a planting anywhere from April 1st in 2024 and later last year, or if you're intending to do tree planting this spring, that is something that potentially you may want to look into, and applications are currently being accepted as well. And I should mention too that the EFP, which I discussed on the previous slide, is a prerequisite to apply to both of these programs. So benefits certainly through the EFP, and it also opens the door to some cost share opportunities. And my last slide here about specific cost share programs, I wanted to mention an open intake. So this program is open at the moment. It's called the Resilient Agricultural Landscape Program, or RELP as we call it. It supports 7 different project categories, and it is funded on a per acre basis. Those amounts are different depending on the project category, and it does also require an environmental farm plan to apply, and commits the individual who applies to maintain that project for a period of time. So a period of several years where you sign a land use agreement and agree not to get rid of your trees and shrubs or change your practice. So those are ones that I wanted to mention, especially because they are open. I will throw in a note too, and I don't have a particular slide for this, but we do have another program that we anticipate an intake this year for the Nature Smart Climate Readiness Program. It does support both grassland and wetland and riparian area projects, and commits the individual to maintaining that for several years as well. And I should have mentioned on the previous slide that both SARFIP and SARPAL, so those various BMPs focused on species at risk, we are anticipating fresh intakes for both of those this year in 2025 too. So if you don't have an EFP yet, and you're curious about any of this, you do have some time to sort of potentially get prepared if you're interested, and sign up for updates to know when those intakes are coming. And I wanted to specifically mention we have a webpage on species at risk resources. As I'm sure you could see in Brenda's presentation, there's so many places where you can find this information, but it's spread out among organizations, and it can be time consuming to do that research. So my colleagues and myself have put together something that's tries to give you somewhere central to find at least some resources about species at risk. So if you're curious, you're welcome to take a look there, and we encourage you to click through. It can give you a bit of a starting point potentially to understand, how do I build a bat roost, or where do I start if I want to put a snake hibernaculum on my farm, and lots of varied resources there. So something I wanted to mention, and in fact, I can throw this link into the chat after I'm done presenting, just so, if you don't have a chance to take this down, I'll make sure that's accessible. So I did not really have time today to go into any real detail with our funding opportunities. Lots of project categories, different programs. It is to be expected that if you're curious, you might have questions. So I wanted to point out our program guide, and again, I will put this in the chat. So funding criteria is listed in these program guides, details for each program. Exact funding criteria is always subject to possible change when new intakes are announced. So something to keep in mind, but generally this is a great place to go to see what's open, what's upcoming, what's not currently accepting applications, but maybe will be. So you can sign up for our program email updates at the bottom of that page to be informed when cost share is coming. And we always encourage folks, if you think you're going to apply later on, potentially, getting your EFP done and lined up beforehand is a really great place to start, because you don't want to feel like you're scrambling and not knowing what you need to apply once the intake is announced. And of course, other possible funding sources. So Brenda had a great summary there too of other places you can look for funding. It can never hurt to ask. So different funding streams and what's available, they do change. And it's always worth reaching out to your local organizations to see what might be available. And some programs do allow types of stacking. It will depend. For instance, sometimes federal funding can't be stacked with federal funding, but maybe it can be stacked with something different. So always worth reaching out and asking around. We certainly see folks through our species at risk programs who get funding from different organizations. It could be conservation authorities or Ducks Unlimited. So yeah, we always encourage folks to ask around. And that was all that I had today. I did want to emphasize that I know this was very much a crash course in only a portion of our cost share programs. And so you are very, very welcome to reach out to myself, to reach out to one of our field representatives too. So they are stationed around the province. And we're happy to help point you to, what might work for your farm, or, if you have a project in mind, is there any funding that might be available for you or might be upcoming? We're very happy to have those conversations with you. So I will share these resources or links in the chat as well. And yeah, that was everything I had today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. That was great. I think that list of resources will be very helpful for the folks on the webinar. And again, thank you, Brenda. I'll now open up the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, again, please put them in the Q&A feature. We have 2 already, and I think they're for you, Sam. So Catherine is asking, is there a minimum acreage for the EFP?
No, there is no minimum acreage. Any farm business is able to participate. Yeah, the ultimately the outcome of your workbook is going to look different depending on your scale of your operation and type of your operation. But the field representative delivering the workshop with you will help work with you on that and sort of tailor the workbook for you. So yeah, but no minimum.
And Greg asks, can a landowner acquire the 50% funding through SARPAL and get the other 50% from another restoration program?
Potentially, yes. So it will depend. SARPAL, I think, does not allow stacking from federal funds. Forgive me, this is where I would have to look myself in the program guide and make sure I'm remembering correctly. But always take a look at those sort of terms and conditions or limits of funding. You can always reach out to us if you're not sure and you have another organization in mind. We can confirm that with you. Worst case, if somebody did apply and declared another source of funding that we saw couldn't be stacked, we would have to limit the amount that your project could receive. Yeah, so good question.
And Renee asks, Sam, does your organization provide farm training programs for kids?
Great question. No, at this point in time, we don't have anything like that ourselves, unfortunately. We have sort of had some conversations with 4-H Canada, but nothing that Soil and Crop delivers in particular. We did have some species at risk coloring books, but they have been handed out at events, and I think we're popular, and we ran out of them sometime last year. But yeah, something we definitely have in mind.
Mm-hmm. And Wilma asks, are grazing field fencing cost share programs still available?
Grazing field fencing, right. So cross fencing for rotational grazing, we are anticipating an intake for the SAR-PAL program coming up this year. So if you have a project in mind that you want to complete in 2025, I would suggest signing up for our emails. And again, I'll put those links in here as soon as I have a moment. But something to keep in mind, I should mention for both SARFIP and SARPAL, for the intakes we anticipate this year, the eligible start date would be April 1st of 2025. So to be eligible, you would have to make sure you don't get invoiced or pay for those costs before April 1st. So something to keep in mind. You don't want to, pay for something and then find out it wouldn't be eligible for the program. But yes, definitely we do anticipate some opportunities upcoming.
Awesome. And I guess this will be the last question. Barbara's asking, is an EFP undertaken in 2009 still valid?
Great question. So the EFP for our current, we call it the edition of the EFP that we require is a 4th edition EFP, and that started being delivered in 2013. So if you're going to apply for cost share, definitely be sure to update. Your EFP certificate should tell you the certificate edition that it is, so 3rd edition or 4th edition. But yes, 2009 would be a 3rd edition, and so you would need to update to a 4th before you could apply.
Awesome. And Brenda, we have a question for you. Mike asks, in terms of the use of sheep for grazing, what number of concentration of sheep would you recommend per acre?
I'm afraid there isn't one set number for that. It really depends on your forage quality and sometimes the breed of sheep or the age of the sheep that you have. Just to give you an idea, I put about 100 sheep on pasture into half-acre paddocks for a day, like a half an acre paddock for a day. And then we have about 49 paddocks at our farm. So we have a 49-day rest period. So, and that's for both the vegetation and for parasite, to try to decrease parasite load. So, it's not just a matter of like how many sheep per acre. There's some more questions to be answered there as well.
Awesome. All right, so I will close off the Q&A session right here. Thank you both, Brenda and Sam. And then I will just finish off our presentation. So if you all are looking to get more involved with OFT or learn more about us, you could explore our farmland protection resources at the ontariofarmlandtrust.ca. You can also remain up to date with OFT's work by following us on social media, as well as subscribing to our newsletter. You could become a member, a donor, or volunteer to help accelerate our farmland protection initiatives. And finally, our events do not end here. We have our Farmland Forum happening in March 20th, 2025. And this year's theme is Watershed Wisdom, Water Protection's Role in Farmland Conservation. Our registration opens on February 1st, so you can learn more at ontariofarmlandtrust.ca/forum. Thank you all again for joining us here today and for engaging with our speakers, Brenda and Sam. Thank you, Brenda and Sam, for your amazing presentations and for sharing all your resources. And with that, I hope you all have a lovely day.